I'm Bob Brown, and I'm the director of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. The year 1945 was a pivotal one in world history, and in order to commemorate the end of World War II, we have interviewed the following Missoulians for their recollections and memories of that very important year. Okay, well, let's start with what is your most vivid memory of the year 1945?
Probably the breakup of the Nazi forces in, well, we were in Germany by that time, and things were so fractured. We were really outnumbered because we were stretched pretty thin, but the Germans were just completely on the rout. And to look forward to the end of the war, I think, was probably as vivid as you can get.
And you played an important role, if minor role there with Goering, is that right?
Yes, he was way down in Austria at the finish of the war, up a real narrow valley. He could have fought his way to safety there for a long time. He surrendered to part of our division, and then I was directed to fly him from that point, Kitzbühel, Austria, back to 7th Army headquarters, where he was turned over. I turned him over to the intelligence officer there, and he was debriefed completely right there. I expected that he would be flown to SHAEF headquarters and make a conditional surrender, and I think that's what he anticipated. But they kept him right in 7th Army headquarters.
And you transported him in rather a unusual vehicle.
That was a Stinson L-5 aircraft, two-seater, tandem. In other words, he sat directly behind me, and 125 horsepower, I think it was. A little larger than the Cub airplane that we usually flew, the L-4. I don't think he'd have ever fit in the L-4. He was around 300 pounds. And as he approached the plane, I got a little apprehensive because he had his, like a Sam Brown belt and a pistol in the holster. Custom of the service that you turn over the conquered sword to the conqueror. So, but that was his aide, Colonel von Brauchisch, relieved him of that before he got to the airplane, so I felt a little more comfortable. But we squeezed him into that airplane, and the seat belt would not quite meet around his belly, so he just grabbed the ends and said, "Das gut, das gut." Away we went.
You did manage to get a signature, though, is that right?
When we landed at 7th Army headquarters, every flight you make out a Form 1 in the aircraft. So I put that up on the cowling and had him sign it, and I pocketed that, kept that as a souvenir, and filled out the regular form to turn in. But then we had almost an affable visit on the way. It was, I think, a little over an hour, and he pointed out his favorite spots in Bavaria, where he grew up, and then we talked about aircraft. The terminology was similar enough so that I could understand him and vice versa. He may have known a lot more English than he exhibited at that time, but I thought one of the interesting things, as we flew along the Autobahn, he told about the jets. They used that for a jet landing strip. And of course it was almost endless. And then there are pine trees at various places, and they just back them up under the pine trees, so it made a perfect airstrip for them.
Wow. Oh.
To me, one of the most impressive things about the American soldier was his ingenuity. And I think that certainly was one of the big reasons that we won the war. I look back at some of the things that the Germans did, and they had ingenious things. Bob, reach behind you and get that little metal affair. Now this is a German stove, pocket stove, and it had its own fuel and so forth. And you put your canteen on top of that, so forth. Well, we didn't have anything that complicated. We just opened up the Jeep hood and ran a little the engine for a while and heated up the coffee. But I did want to say a little more about the resourcefulness of the American soldier. I know when I was going to fly into southern France, my sergeant installed a Jeep tank in the back seat of this Cub, and that gave me considerably more fuel because I could use a wobble pump and fill up the header tank, and that was typical of our GIs. The Germans were certainly the best trained military force at their peak, I think, that ever existed. However, they had one real fault which was not prevalent in our forces, and that is they were highly regimented, highly controlled. If a man was good at a combat situation, that's where he stuck. If he was logistics, he was really bound into that. We were cross-trained to a great extent, and also our enlisted men, if something happened to an officer, there were enlisted people who could step right up and be very competent in leadership and direction and so forth. And I think that was a big advantage to us. On our way through Germany, we were moving pretty fast at this particular time, but we, in our line of march was the town of Landsberg, and outside the town there was an internment camp made originally for about 500 internees, but the Nazis had crowded about 1,500 in there. When we arrived, they were corpses piled up throughout the compound. One or two were just barely moving. It was a horrible sight. It happened to be the same internment camp where Hitler was interned. As the Nazis were coming to power, they were pretty much thugs at the time, and he was put into this prison camp in I think about 1928 or in that vintage, and there he composed most of Mein Kampf. And here in 1945 he turned, or during the war, he had interned his own people there. I assume most of them were Jewish. Well, our division artillery commander, General Hess, assigned a mission to one of his aides, who was also Jewish, to get the townspeople and have them bury these corpses. Some of the townspeople denied that they ever knew anything about this camp, but they certainly knew it afterwards. They picked the corpses up and carried them to a burial spot, and the aide took a series of pictures, and I was lucky enough to receive them. But a very, very traumatic experience to see this event.
Hmm. What was the occupation of Germany like?
Well, we were more or less insulated from the population. So it was just a continuation of military duty. However, the occupation of Berlin was quite a different item from the occupation of Bremen, because there we had tremendous numbers of Russian soldiers. They had not been relieved of any of their weapons, so they'd go out and get liquored up and start shooting things. One strange thing I noticed when I got to Berlin was that all the naval officers would sort of stick around and visit a little while at the place where we ate dinner, and then they would all leave together. Well, it wasn't long before I was doing the same thing. I had my right hand in my overcoat pocket, and my fingers were curled pretty carefully around the safety on my .45. And it wasn't long before I started sleeping with a loaded .45 under my pillow.
Is that because of the Russians?
Well, the Russians didn't care where they shot, and there were also some unreconstructed Nazis around, quite a number. Oh, we had some of those in Bremen and Bremerhaven also, but not nearly as abundant.
Did you form any impression of the common German citizen, the type of life they were leading at this time, or any impressions at all? I know you said you were rather insulated, but...
We did encounter a few German people, and they seemed no different in their attitudes from the people we had encountered in this country. They were ordinary citizens, and it seems to me that most of them were totally unaware of some of the more horrible things that were done by the leadership. And they were having a terrible time surviving. But in our contacts with them, they were very gentlemanly and upright. In military government, we were not too well organized. And the net result is, some days we were busy, some days we weren't. Then I was put on temporary additional duty status with the Naval Technical Mission Europe. And the fellow who was in charge of the Bremen headquarters was sent back to Washington. So here I was, made officer in charge of the Bremen headquarters at Lieutenant J.G. The fellows who came through, regular Navy, reserves, you name it, were, there were lieutenant commanders, maybe a few first lieutenants, commanders, captains, you name it. Everyone outranked me. So that was a little bit interesting. They would fly in from Paris, where the headquarters was located, and I would have to supply them with jeeps. Some of them drove themselves, some had to have drivers. To keep this thing going became quite a nightmare. And I can recall times when I had a cot next to the telephone, and I didn't bother to take my uniform off at night. I just flopped on the cot and slept between phone calls. Other times I was fortunate and got a good night's sleep. So I went from having not enough to do to having way too much for a while.
Well, what types of things were you overseeing for the government?
Well, it was a technical mission unit. So people were sent out to find particularly training devices. The Germans had a tremendous number of training devices. So they would find these, they would send them back, or the training manuals also. And in addition, we would try to scout out their research work. Now, some of the items that we sent back were very small, of course.
some were quite large. I wasn't there, but some of the fellows that were sent out to find things told me that a really hilarious occurrence was at the airport in Paris. A number of senior officers of the Army were getting ready to go home. And all of a sudden, a truck pulls up, and whoever was filling out the roster said, "Hey, you guys, get off." And on board went a German Schnorkel for a submarine. And some of the fellows said, "You should have seen the looks on the faces of those guys who were bumped."
Not used to that kind of treatment.
That's right. And the biggest outfit we sent back was a German submarine. It was a small one. It was sent back as deck cargo on a freighter. Well, you put that on one side of the superstructure of a ship and it's going to list. So they hoisted a tug on the other side. And apparently that was a mighty odd-looking combination heading out to sea.
That would be great.
Later, when I was back in the States, I read a newspaper article about a U.S. Navy submarine that had done 25 knots underwater. I know just exactly what submarine that was.
Well, the Germans were so far ahead in research in so many different areas.
Well, the thing that made them lose the war, more than anything else, was that their high command was more fouled up than ours.
Tell us about the Italian campaign there at the last months of the war.
Well, we landed in Italy, it was Christmas Eve at Naples, 44 that would have been. And we went on the front about January 6th. And at that time it was a static line. The Rome Arno campaign had happened in the fall just prior to that, and it petered out in the Apennine Mountains north of Pisa, and the line was static, and we were put in a little town called Vidiacatico, and on February 19th we made our first major attack on Riva Ridge, the 1st Battalion, 86th, and then the rest of the division followed against Mount Belvedere the next day. Mount Belvedere had been taken by about 3 units before we got there, but they could never hold it because Riva Ridge, which sat next to it, the Germans had miles and miles of observation off of that, and the minute they'd get on Belvedere, they'd just plaster them so bad they couldn't hold it. And so when our division went in, we took Riva first, and then 24 hours later, the rest of the division went in on Belvedere, and by the second night, they were about 3-4 miles beyond Belvedere.
Ah.
Well, I can't really say that it did. We were kind of the forgotten front in a sense, because most of the attention was on the Western Front.
How was the fighting in Italy?
Well, it was war, and it was real rough. In fact, to give you some idea, in 4 months, we were the last division assigned to the European theater. We lost 997 killed, another 3,000 wounded, which tells you that it was, you know, we were in peril at all times. However, the Luftwaffe wasn't active there. All of that had moved to the Western Front or in Russia and so on. For a while there, we'd see one lone plane that had come in the evening and drop a few anti-personnel bombs. In fact, he was so regular coming in, we called him Bed Check Charlie, and I got a cartoon in there of that. So it was not maybe the intensity of the Western Front, but it was still war. all of us, throughout the whole training, throughout the time in combat, we all said, boy, when this is over, we're going to really have a blast, we're going to really have a party and whatnot. But on the day it ended actually on May 3rd in Italy. It was a little later on the Western Front. When the news came down, we had just moved across the Po Valley. We broke out of the Apennine Mountains, went across that valley in a couple weeks' time, hundreds of miles across there, and we were in the lower Alps when it ended, but everybody was dog-tired. And so they did nothing for about 2-3 days. And the real party didn't come till about 2 weeks later. Our regiment overran a huge German warehouse in Bologna, and it was filled with thousands of bottles of French champagne. So the Fifth Army glommed onto it and gave every man a fifth of champagne and all the non-commissioned officers cognac. And then's when the party hit. And that was a wild one.
Okay, well, why don't we just start by, what was your strongest memory of 1945? Where were you and what was your strongest memory?
Well, I think there are several strong memories. We had fled from what is today Poland, which then of course was German, and stayed in a train station in a small town in northern Germany. My mother was a nurse, and the trains were driving by and stopped to unload people who had been shot from the planes, and so there was lots of bandaging and lots of blood is one of the memories. The other one was we were there in February of 45, and I remember very poignantly, May 8, I came from school, and people were stopping on the street and everybody was yelling, "The war's over, the war's over." And just 2 weeks ago, I was back in that same old little town where time stood still completely. It was East Germany. And the corner is still there. So this poignant memory of the war's over, the war's over, everybody was jubilant, although I was only a 7.5-year-old kid, that was very deep-seated. We lived in Köslin, which is today Koszalin in Poland, that was that part that Germany had to surrender to Poland. And while we fled in January of 45, we heard the Russian artillery behind us. And my mother, as a nurse, was a nurse on the last hospital train with wounded soldiers. And so I remember also their gore and blood and being strafed in the train. There was no food, there was no heat on that train. I don't quite remember how we got to that place where I remembered, where I saw the end of the war. There's some hole in some memories. Either you try to get rid of that memory or you just simply don't know. And so the fleeing was general, as you know. More than 4 million German people in 1945 left that part which is now Western Poland. And I revisited everything there two weeks ago, and it was amazing to see how time stood still, that everything is still just exactly like I remembered it. It has shrunk a bit because I was little. After we fled with absolutely nothing. The only thing we had was that since it was winter, my mother made me put on several layers of clothing, and she sewed a few pieces of jewelry into her winter coat. We had nothing, and so we were at the mercy of the relatives who took us in, which was nothing unusual at the time. There was a terrible lack of provisions. It was a total chaos. There was nothing to eat. So I remember that you stood in line and were so hungry that you fainted, and you got rations. I think that took about 4 or 5 months before you had regular ration cards. You got a little loaf of bread, you got a few frozen potatoes because nothing had been taken care of, and frozen potatoes are something horrible. Onions were available, and occasionally a shot horse was on the street, and the women dashed out and butchered them in the middle of the night. The Russians then opened a small hospital in that tiny town, primarily to take care of all the illnesses they had caused as conquerors. And then there was rations of butter that came directly from the Russians to that hospital. Since my mother worked in the hospital, I got occasionally something wonderful like an egg or something incredible like a piece of butter. So we hungered. Actually, the worst part of the hunger was in 1947 because that was a horribly cold winter. And the whole in East Germany was just being founded in '48, and so there was a lot of turmoil from the division of Germany, and the provisions just were not there, and so everybody turned up to have what was called a glandular type of tuberculosis. There was nothing unusual; whole schools had it, and so the remnants of that is scars on everybody's bodies and hang-ups that you can't throw any food away. That you're very frugal and economical, and that partially, as you know, contributed to the German so-called economic miracle, the German frugality, which was taught the hard way at that time. So it's any childhood fun, as you know it, in a sane society, I have not had any of that. We went and we picked the potato bugs from the fields when the fields were again active. That's what we did to get the diseases of the potatoes. We gleaned the fields after they had been plowed or after the harvest, the rye and wheat fields for any leftover stock. So it was mainly food grabbing. Money was also not around, not that I know of.
Life under the Russian occupation.
And pretty much unimpeded after, the German life continued without any major harassment after the first few months. The first few months were horrible. They behaved like the stereotypical conqueror behaves, and very vivid pictures in my mind, which is not good for a family video. So the fear, especially of the young women, of any Russians walking down the street in this small town was just tremendous. The propaganda was very, very well organized, from what I can gather now looking back, that we were told that communism was the ideal type of government, that we're now a country of farmers and workers and farmers, which my mother severely objected to because after all she was an educated lady, that everybody is equal. And so that was presented in small spoonfuls of knowledge in school throughout everything. The revision of history too, you didn't talk anymore about the Kaisers and the emperors and so forth. You talked more about Lenin and his messages and Trotsky and so forth and so on. So that type was very well organized. They must have done a huge amount of preparation before the victory over Germany, how they are going to re-educate the population. And of course, at this small, young an age, it was difficult to keep apart what was right and true and what wasn't. So also there was a relearning process then later when in 51 we went to West Germany where I had to relearn everything. And of course I had to be put a class behind because I hadn't had any English or any French. And this is why I still have that strong accent, German accent in English, because I learned English at a rather old age. That's one of the reasons for the accent, besides the grooming it.
What is your most outstanding memory of 1945?
First, the most outstanding memory is May the 11th, 1945, when the Bunker Hill aircraft carrier flagship for Task Force 58 was hit off the bottom of Kyushu after a raid by that task force. And before that, you always say what's happened to 1945, you always have to have a beginning. And my beginning, I was a 17-year-old high school student in Deer Lodge, Montana. That was a sure thing when you graduate from high school. You were gone to the service. And you would watch the movie, the newsreels on Chihuahua and Guadalcanal and crawl through the mud in North Africa. And I thought, hey, I don't want to do that. And so that I enlisted in January of 1944. And it took me twice through because I was a little colorblind. And so the Navy didn't really want colorblind people. So I stood to the side, and when I could read the side and they needed people nearby, I could read the numbers. And I left the day after I graduated from high school with a class of 44 in 44. And everybody was gone. And there were no men or anything left. And I went to Farragut, Idaho to go to boot camp. And I graduated from boot camp and went to radar school in Point Loma, California, and was assigned to the USS Bunker Hill. And then, of course, we went right into action from Ulithi and Iwo Jima and Okinawa and Kyushu getting ready to go into Japan. And every morning we would go out and the Japs would come in and you could walk in, you've all seen the pictures, you could walk out there and see all the flak. And we were, being a radarman, you were, if you weren't assigned to plotting your planes, you were assigned to watching the radar. And every 45 minutes they would give you a break. And this one fellow by the name of Brennan was sure we were going to get killed. And we were on break, and we were down at, I can't remember what they call it in the Navy anymore. Alan, do you remember? Sure. All the open decks were open and so forth and so on. And one of the carriers kept saying, we got bogeys over you, and we sent people up out of our flyers and couldn't find anything. And all of a sudden, the first one hit, and you know when you're hit. And the CIC and Aviation Ready Room or air plot, as they call it, was armor plated all around, and it was about 1.5 foot or 2 feet of armor plating. And Brennan, when the first one hit, he ran out the door, and right by the aviation ready rooms, and he was the only one that was killed. Mm. He was, and someone you learn in boot camp to obey orders, and without question. And someone said, an officer, someone said this way, and we walked up. I got burned all on this side, and that's 50 years later. I got a Purple Heart for it, and because I was on the wounded list. And someone said, why don't you send your discharge in and send, because you're on the wounded list, which I did. And ironically, about 2 months later, it comes a Purple Heart in a little box, and I'm sure it's not the box that I showed you here. It was a model that looked like a paper had been made in Japan, which is but we survived. We survived.
Now, how many men didn't?
370. It says 373, but 392 was the official death. And that was second only to the Franklin, which lost about 900. And we watched the Franklin burn. And the Franklin was another carrier, SH-class carrier of the same class. We weighed 27,000 tons, and the new ones weighed 95,000 tons. So they're just a whole world of difference. Yeah. But we had about 3,000 men, and a carrier is a town within itself, and you have everything. And like Alan and I were on the same ship for probably 15 to 17 months, and never knew each other, and worked probably 50 feet away. Now, Alan might have something more to add in what his exciting thing was, because he was out among them. He was on the, where they really shoot at you. I was protected by armor plating.
On the day we got whackered, because we carried an admiral I worked for and slept for, and I was in my sleeping compartment, which is right under the flight deck, forward in number 1 elevator. And we'd been at condition 1 easy, you know, supposed to be where you're supposed to be, but not on it. When this crunch, which didn't sound like an explosion to me, I thought, did somebody run into us? And in about 20 seconds, well, there was a second crunch. Well, of course, by then all of the claxons were going off, and we knew. Well, I had to stay right there, and then when they got organized, we hauled fire hoses out, and I'm in that one of those pictures in the Life magazine. I sat on a fire hose. There were 4 of us, so we were lucky. Our hose had pressure, and we was on that fire hose from probably 10:30, 11:15 till about 3 in the afternoon. And a lot of that time we spent just keeping one of the handling rooms cool. The sprinklers hadn't gone off under one of the 5-inch guns, and it was full ammunition, and so it was our job to keep it from blowing up. Part of it after, you know. Yeah. And I don't know what else to tell you. When Mia interviewed us, why she asked about being scared and stuff. Well, you're trained, and we did what we had to do. But when I got back to the compartment, peeled off my shoes, and of course worked in water, and it was hot. The tar and the caulking in the flight deck would bubble. It was so hot underneath, you know, and I knew it was hot, but we had water. And peeled this left sock off inside out and took all the hide off the bottom of my foot. But there were a lot of guys a lot worse shape. That's all really that happened to me. The other sock I worked at loose first, see. But I'd catch all of the Chinese crud and all the athlete's foot and stuff. Had changed medicines every 6 months for several years after that. It doesn't bother now.
It was awfully hot, and a lot of people went over the side. Several hundred went over the side because they were forced off by the smoke. And I remember this fellow, he had a big mustache like this. He's about ready to go over the side, and he said, some old man, probably 22, came over to me and said, son, don't go over the side there, you don't know what's down there, and up here it's going to get better. And so that, you know, those are things you remember too. It made, as you watched me read there, and I became emotional in the tears, and it still affects me. And I still feel it way, way deep that nothing else that I've ever experienced could even come close to it.
I can remember a couple of things happened that stick with me. While we were in the process of fighting this fire, there were a couple of guys that were looting bodies, and that's probably as close as I ever came to losing it. It was not my turn on the hose. I had an axe, and I can still remember the feeling, you know. Yeah.
And like Alan was saying, when you do that, you pull someone out, and there's an arm just comes loose, and the flesh comes loose.
We ran out of weights. They had a regular funeral weight that they used, and they put them in the canvas bags. We ran out of those, and they used 5-inch projectiles to sew them in the canvas bags. I remember that. The next day, when the hospital ship came alongside to take the wounded, was kind of a shocker, because you can't imagine how filthy a fire on a steel ship is, the oil and stuff. It's unbelievable. But and last, I don't remember, Sunday, must have been last Sunday night. Why, my neighbors had a relative visiting who was a nurse on that ship, and the shock of seeing that white ship and all these people in white uniforms and white dresses running up and down this deck, you know, and here we were so dirty, just made an impression. The ocean was really smooth that day, the day we got whackered, and we could watch the whaleboats out picking up the crew. We had about 400, I think, in the water, and destroyers sent out whaleboats. One of the 2 or 3 of the fighter planes saw a school of sharks coming, and they blasted them, you know, with their guns. And to my knowledge, we didn't lose anybody to sharks, you know, things like that.
Yeah.
Some funny stuff. We had, prior to that, we were re-spotting planes. We'd lost our little tractors, and the skipper went ashore and traded some guy out of Jeeps, 3 Jeeps. One of them's in that picture. And they stripped everything. The highest thing stuck up was a steering wheel. And this kid had just unhooked from a plane in the rain. Foot slipped off of the clutch, and the last I saw him out over the side, and then over the port side, and then here he was bobbing up down in the middle of a 16-man life raft, and they fished him out and brought him back, and skipper, Seitz was his name. He was a German, and I'd have believed him if he'd have said the world was square. He had presence of mind enough while we still had power that he did a 2-degree turn and spilled thousands of gallons. See, we landed an air group, and they had fueled them and put the ammunition in the wings, but they hadn't brought the bombs up yet for the next run when this happened. And that was the difference between us and the Franklin. See, but we had all this fuel burning. And he did a 2-degree turn and spilled all that stuff out, not all of it, but huge amount of it. Then we lost our steering, and that's when the Wilkes-Barre had to come along, because we were headed right towards the island, and he came along and nudged us around. So I got to see all of this.
It's really hard to explain to anyone the emotion you feel for a ship. I mean, it's like a marriage. It's almost deeper than a marriage. I mean, it's just, here we are sitting, 2 old guys at 50 years ago, and when we're sitting here thinking about it, it's just like it was yesterday. I mean, it's, you were young, and, you had a whole world before you, and you were asking me, Dr. Brown, about the things you remember. I remember the death. I remember the cooked bodies. I remember the debris. And I remember all those people that once were there no more.
November 2nd, the day you got home must have been a really great day.
That was a memorable day, because I got home on the Milwaukee Road and at the depot I was met by my wife and 2-month-old son.
2 months. That must have been, can't imagine it. Can't imagine it. But 1945 was a year of a lot of memories, a lot of big events. Anything really stand out?
Yeah, there's several things during that year. They're all good, or humorous anyway, if you can believe it. I went through the whole war without either firing an angry shot or being fired at angrily, as far as I know. I was on 3 Liberty ships. One of them went clear around the world, and 1 tanker, and then I finally got on the aircraft carrier, the Shenango, CVE 28. In the last few months of the war, I got on that. Started out for it in February or March, and I was held up for a month and a half in Honolulu, and that was sort of rough duty there for a while. One memorable thing at that point was that I sunk Admiral Halsey and almost ruined the war.
How did you sink Admiral Halsey?
There was a bunch of us going to CIC school, and we went down to the bay to swim. And it was just about the end of the swim time, and I was racing back for the dock, and I saw a girl off over this way, sort of smiling at me, and I thought, I don't know her, what's she smiling at me for? And then all of a sudden I whammed into somebody, and I could just feel him going way, way, way down. Finally he came up in a great big barrel chest, and it was Admiral Housey. I said, pardon me, sir, and I really made record time back to the dock. So that was my only encounter with a top brass.
Well, how was life aboard ship? I mean, what types of things did you do? How was the food?
Oh, the food was excellent. And, of course, we had the officers' mess. And I suppose, I never heard the crew persons talk about bad mess. One thing about the Navy, you either had good bunks, dry beds, and good food, or you had nothing.
And at the time, in 1945, we carried cargo from Manus Island up to the Philippines. We'd go through the Gulf, Leyte Gulf, and we would discharge cargo there. We would go up to Mindoro, and then we would go up to Subic Bay, which at that time didn't amount to much but almost like a tent city, it seemed to me, and a few barges where we unloaded cargo, and then ships would come in and pick up their cargo from that.
Well, what type of things did you do for entertainment?
Well, sometimes when we did get to the shore, there were outdoor theaters and so forth that we would go and watch some movies. Sometimes you watch the same movie 5 or 6 times, but it was something different. And then on board ship, you had movies, but you only had 3 movies, say, to take with you, and then you traded them in when you got to another port, and you might have been 2 weeks at sea. So, and played cards, and once in a while, if you're lucky, you got to see a UFO show. Stayed.
How was the food?
I thought the food was good, except one time when we were in New Caledonia. Supply ships hadn't come in, and we ate quite a bit of spam and crackers. And some of the crackers you had to beat them like that, get the bugs out, and bite real quick. But otherwise, I had no complaint about the food. Although I did think I had been a cook in the CCCs, but I went into the mechanical department in the Navy. And I did think that some of those cooks could sure ruin some good meat. You know? Oh, she's trying to tell me about the Navy. It was standard. Every Wednesday morning and Saturday morning you had beans for breakfast. And oh, those people used to complain about it. But I loved them. I thought the Navy had the best way to cook beans that there was. And I wish I knew how they did it.
What is your strongest memory of that year?
Well, it's strange to say this, but the strongest memory is what I don't remember. Since we started this, Dan has brought up some things, and then I couldn't answer the questions, and I've been thinking back, and this has really bothered me because I left, I don't even know leaving the ship, but I left the destroyer in either ADAC or AT-2, and I ended up in the Fort Richardson Hospital in Anchorage, Army. And I don't know why I was there, how I got there, and it just, and I never noticed this or thought of this or until Dan started talking to me. I'm lost.
that would be an eerie feeling, yeah. Now, tell me about your ship.
Well, I was on a destroyer. I forget the complement. I think it was around 89. Well, I shouldn't say because I really don't know. But I was in the fire control crew, and we were the ones that took care of the guns as far as their aiming and controls. And it was uneventful. Every day was just another day, except that we were a public relations
team is what it amounted to. I think there were 7 destroyers and 2 cruisers. And what we were doing was bombarding Japan. This was public relations, although flight over Tokyo got all the publicity. We were there shooting just about every month of bombardment, but nobody ever heard about it. At least we didn't, you know, as far as the communiques are concerned.
What types of things did you do to entertain yourself?
Well, mainly we read books and mostly just sat around and told sea stories. You know, I can outdo you. First liar doesn't have a chance. No, we just talk. It's surprising, you know, you get a bunch of people together. We had what they call a IC room where we worked and where our computer was and everything else. And so we used to sit around there and drink coffee. Never drank coffee or smoked a cigarette till I got in the Navy. And then you did that. Well, you always had a dirty rag, a wrench, or a cup of coffee in your hand. You're either going to a job or coming from a job, or else you're having a coffee break, see, when somebody wants you to do something. So you learn how to get around those things.
Do you remember any specific individuals on a ship?
Oh yeah, really. Several really good. I mean, you make friends. I mean, you know, when a couple of planes are flying down on you or something, you know, you learn to be dependent on other people, and that dependency turns into, well, I don't know how to say it, but selfish friendship, let's put it that way. You become friends, and you're looking out for yourself, and you're looking out for that person too, because he's looking out for you. And
what is a storm like in a destroyer?
Well, to give you an example, well, I don't know, I'll just guess that your deck in the back is probably 5 feet off freeboard, from the deck down to the water. I mean, I'm probably wrong, but you know, that's underwater most of the time. And so you have to travel on kind of a walkway above that. And an example was a guy, I can always remember this, a guy got hit by a wave, and when you lock the hatches, you got these, well, they're long things with a sharp, not a sharp, but a fairly sharp end. And I remember this guy got hamstrung up against there, and he passed out. And it happened that, I don't know why, but I happened to see him, couldn't hear him, and I couldn't lift him. What I mean is, you know, when the guy's like that, so I had to try to get about, well, I think I got about 3 other guys, and we lifted him off the hook, and geez, he was yeah, one time, I don't know, sometime in the past, well, we had a lot of, I mean, big boxers. We had like the fleet champion, heavyweight boxing, you know, the light heavyweight champion, and plus some others. And actually, we did more fighting among the crew than we did with the Japs. And it so happened that some time before, the chief cook had beat up the chief gunner's mate. So what happened was the gunner's mate was in bed. No, the cook was in bed, sleeping, and the gunner's mate went into the locker and came out with I think he thought it was a 45, but it was a 22 on a 45 frame. Looked like a 45 caliber. And he pumped about 3 bullets into his stomach. And of course that caused a commotion. And then we had another time where a guy from another ship, we used to tie up like 3 destroyers, and the guy from another ship was lipping off to this one fellow just across, you know, 20 feet away. And this big guy jumped over and hit this guy. He hit him just once, right in the chin, and broke his neck. Well, we were a crew that people stayed away from.
I think so.
We've had several bad incidents where the bootleggers were trying to sell us some booze, and they upped it, like it was, I think, about $15 a bottle, and then when it came time to hand it over, why, it was $20 a bottle. So he just collects the bottles and passes them on. I'm just a kid, you know, and I'm taking the bottles, and all at once I heard this commotion, and we left. And here this guy was just beat to pieces, the bootlegger, and he didn't get a nickel out of the deal. But those are the old time regulars. Us reserves, we were nice.
You also mentioned court martials. Tell us about some of those court martials.
Well, it just seemed like every time we were going to go on R&R, we'd have a court martial, and so we'd have to stay here and go through the whole thing. And I don't know if here's a good one. We were up there in the Aleutians, and the chief was mad at us. I forget why, but so he had us up there on the director. One guy wiping the director in the storm, you know, light rain, wiping the director, and the other guy slapping paint on. See, well, you know, tomorrow it's going to blister. So I told the guys in my group, I said, the hell with it, let's just sit down here and have coffee. So we had coffee, and so then they charged me with mutiny, and I was going to get a court martial. Well, I used to write, I'd write to my mother, and when I knew the gunnery officer was censoring the mail, I'd write to my mother and tell her how they were picking on me, and you know, this was long before we got this equal employment and all this other stuff, you know. I was telling them how, telling her how they were picking on me because I was a butler and because I was such a good sailor, and you know, and really it was undeserved, and that she should tell Senator LaFollette. He was a good friend of my dad's, and you know, of course my dad, he'd just say, forget it, you know, but that's why I was crying to my mother. So the gunnery officer come on, do you really mean to say this, host? I said, that's the truth, by God, you guys are picking on me. And this went on for maybe a month or two. Finally, they dropped the charges, political influence, PI, on my name, you know, after my serial number. And when I found that out, man, I was really a hellion.
I'm Bob Brown, and I'm the director of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. The year 1945 was a pivotal one in world history. And in order to commemorate the end of World War II, we have interviewed the following Missoulians for their recollections and memories of that very important year.
Okay, well,